Shadowland. Chapter 1. The Omen. The town of Grenton sat quietly nestled between the rolling hills of Maine, its ordinary life moving forward like the slow current of the river that cut through its center. People went about their lives with a sense of quiet contentment. The town had an old-world charm, with its cobblestone streets, century-old houses, and the steeple of the church visible from almost every corner. But something had changed in Grenton. It wasn't noticeable at first, just an odd chill in the morning air, the sun seemingly rising later and setting sooner. Then came the fog, thick and heavy, swallowing the town whole, lingering like a bad dream even as the rest of the world carried on in daylight. Children spoke of shadows moving where there should be none. They whispered about voices in the dark, calling out names in a tone that dripped with malevolence. The adults dismissed these tales as figments of overactive imaginations. Until the night it came for Lila. Lila had always been a bright girl, a fixture of the town's small library where she worked as an assistant, known for her inquisitive mind and ready smile. But one evening, after closing up, she disappeared. Her car was found abandoned near the edge of the forest that bordered the town. The driver's door flung open, keys still in the ignition. A few muddy footprints led into the woods, but they abruptly stopped a mere 30 feet in. Panic gripped Grenton. The sheriff organized search parties, but no one dared venture too far into the darkening woods. Something had shifted in the air. It was heavier now, darker. That same evening, the streetlights in town flickered out, one by one. A dense, impenetrable blackness enveloped the town, far thicker than any fog or cloud cover could explain. And as the darkness grew, so too did a pervasive sense of dread. People gathered at the church, hoping the light within might ward off whatever had taken Lila. Fear swept through Grenton like a cold wind. The darkness was not natural, it was alive. It moved, it watched, and in the stillness of the night, they could hear it whispering. "Do you hear that?" Old Mrs. Garrett asked, her voice trembling as she gripped the arm of Father Michael. She had lived through 70 winters in Grenton but had never felt fear like this. Father Michael didn't answer. His face was pale, his eyes fixed on the windows. Outside, the shadows swirled, coiling around the town like a serpent tightening its grip. No one could explain it, but they all felt it. A presence in the dark, something ancient and angry. And it wanted more than just Lila. It was only the beginning. Would the townspeople survive the long night, or had Shadowland already claimed its first soul? Want to find out what happens next? Share and subscribe to see how deep the darkness goes. Chapter 2. The Vanishing. The day after Lila's disappearance, a strange silence settled over Grenton. It wasn't the peaceful quiet the town had always known. It was an oppressive stillness, like the world was holding its breath. The fog, which had once clung to the edges of town, now thickened to the point that even stepping outside felt like walking into another world, one where light didn't exist. Sheriff Donnelly stood in his office, phone pressed against his ear, listening to the static that greeted every call to the outside world. The lines were down. Even the internet, the lifeline for most people, had gone dark. No one could reach Grenton, and no one could leave. By midday, the town square, normally bustling with activity, was eerily empty. Shops were closed, windows shuttered, and the streets lay deserted. The residents huddled in their homes, whispering prayers, but it didn't feel like enough. At the church, Father Michael gathered the townspeople, offering words of hope. But behind his eyes was something else, an unease that couldn't be shaken. The dark had a way of creeping into one's soul, and the longer it lingered, the harder it became to fight. Among those in attendance was Ben, Lila's older brother, his face hard with determination and worry. He hadn't slept since his sister vanished, spending hours combing the woods near where her car had been found, yet turning up nothing. "I need volunteers," Ben said, stepping forward in the church. His voice was raw, barely holding back the emotion. "We can't just sit here waiting for this thing, whatever it is, to take more of us." Murmurs rippled through the crowd, but no one moved. No one dared step into the unknown when it seemed the dark had taken on a life of its own. Even the bravest among them hesitated. It was Marcus, the town's mechanic, who finally stood up. He wiped grease-stained hands on his jeans and said, "I'll help. We can't hide forever." With the ice broken, a handful of others reluctantly agreed. Together, they formed a small search party, their faces grim as they prepared to head into the ever-thickening fog. Before they left, Father Michael stopped them. "Take these," he said, handing out candles and small, polished silver crosses. "They may not protect you from whatever is out there, but they might help you remember the light." Ben accepted the candle, though he wasn't sure what good it would do. In the last few days, light seemed to offer little comfort in a world ruled by shadow. As the group made their way through the fog, the air grew colder, and the silence became unbearable. It wasn't long before the forest loomed ahead, the same place where Lila had vanished. "She couldn't have gone far," Marcus muttered, scanning the tree-line. His breath misted in the cold air. Ben nodded, though dread gnawed at his gut. Every step felt wrong, like they were moving deeper into something unnatural, something old and malevolent. They called out her name. "Lila!" The echoes were swallowed by the fog, and in the distance, a faint sound answered, a low, guttural growl that chilled them to the bone. Ben's heart raced. "Did you hear that?" The others stopped, straining to listen. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of something large moving through the underbrush. Without warning, a shadow darted between the trees, too fast to be human, too big to be anything natural. "Run!" Ben shouted, but the group was already scattering, fear overtaking any plan they had. The darkness seemed to close in around them, making it impossible to see more than a few feet ahead. Ben sprinted, his breath ragged, the candle flickering in his hand. But as he ran, he noticed something horrifying. The shadow wasn't chasing them. It was hurting them, driving them deeper into the forest, towards something waiting in the blackness. Suddenly, Marcus, who had been ahead, cried out. His scream was cut short, replaced by a sickening silence. Ben skidded to a stop, panic flooding his veins. When he turned around, Marcus was gone. There was no trace of him, no footprints, nothing but the oppressive dark. And in that moment, Ben realized the truth. The shadow wasn't just in the forest. It was everywhere, and no one was safe. Can Ben uncover the truth before it's too late? Share and subscribe to follow the terrifying path ahead. Chapter 3. The Eyes in the Dark. Ben stood frozen, his breath shallow as the forest seemed to close in around him. The fog swirled, almost alive, carrying with it a cold that chilled him to his core. Marcus was gone, vanished into the darkness like Lila. He could still hear the rustle of the leaves, but it was distant now, as if the forest itself had swallowed him whole. "Marcus!" Ben's voice echoed weakly in the stillness, the name dissipating into the fog. There was no answer, only the steady rhythm of his heart pounding in his ears. Ben gripped the small candle Father Michael had given him, its flame flickering wildly in the dense air. He scanned the trees, searching for any sign of movement, any hint of where Marcus had gone. But the shadows moved in unnatural ways, shifting, twisting, as though something far older and darker than he could comprehend was watching him. Then he saw them, eyes, not one pair, but many, glowing faintly from within the trees. They watched him with a hunger that made his skin crawl. These weren't the eyes of animals, they were something worse, something waiting. The wind picked up, whispering his name through the branches. "Ben!" His grip tightened on the candle. The fog thickened, and for a moment, he thought he saw something. A figure, shrouded in shadow, standing motionless just beyond the tree line. It was too far to make out details, but the shape of it, tall and slender, seemed all wrong, as if it didn't belong to this world. Instinct told him to run, but his legs felt rooted to the ground. Every part of him screamed that whatever this was, it had no place in the world of the living. Yet it stood there, waiting, watching. "Lila," he whispered, half hoping, half fearing. The figure didn't move, but the eyes, those terrible eyes, multiplied in the dark, creeping closer, surrounding him. Ben took a step back, his heart hammering in his chest. "What do you want?" he called out, though he wasn't sure who or what he was speaking to. The fog swirled again, this time coiling around his ankles, as though it had a mind of its own. The trees groaned, their branches bending unnaturally under the weight of some unseen force. The darkness was closing in, and it wanted him. Suddenly, a voice broke through the eerie quiet, a low, familiar voice. "Ben, get out of there." It was Marcus, his voice strained, coming from the trees behind him. Ben whipped around, but there was no sign of him. "Marcus, where are you?" His voice trembled, the fear gnawing at him. Marcus's voice was cut off again, replaced by a loud, unnatural crack from the forest floor. It was as if the earth itself had split open, and with it, something shifted beneath. Something large. Ben didn't wait. He turned and bolted, sprinting through the trees, the candle's small flame barely lighting his path. Behind him, the shadows surged, closing in, moving faster now, as though they had grown impatient with their game. As he ran, Ben could feel the ground shaking beneath him. A rhythmic thud, 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 like footsteps too heavy to belong to any living creature. His legs burned, his lungs screamed for air, but he didn't dare stop. The darkness was chasing him, and with it, the realization that there was no escape. The town had become a prison. Suddenly, the church bell rang out, its deep, mournful chime cutting through the night. Ben's heart leaped. The church, if he could just make it back there, maybe Father Michael could help. Maybe there was still time. The bell tolled again, and again, louder now, as though urging him forward. Ben stumbled into the clearing, the steeple of the church barely visible through the fog. His legs gave out and he collapsed on the steps, gasping for air. The darkness, which had been right behind him, seemed to hesitate, retreating slightly as if the light from the church offered some small protection. But as Ben looked up, his relief was short-lived. Standing at the entrance to the church, bathed in the dim glow of the candlelight, was Lila. Her eyes were wide, unblinking, and she was smiling. A smile too cold, too distant to be his sister's. "Lila?" he whispered, dread clawing at his insides. But she didn't respond. She just stood there, silent, staring, her smile never faltering as the shadows writhed around her feet. This wasn't Lila. Not anymore. What has happened to Lila? And what dark force has taken hold of the town? Share and subscribe for the terrifying answers. Chapter 4. The Gathering Shadows. Ben stared at Lila, his heart caught between relief and terror. She hadn't moved from the church steps, her eyes fixed on him with that unsettling smile. The fog swirled at her feet, clinging to her like a second skin. Every instinct screamed at him that something was wrong. This wasn't the sister he had grown up with, the one who laughed easily and filled rooms with warmth. "Lila," he repeated, standing slowly, his legs still trembling from the sprint. What happened? Where have you been?" She tilted her head slightly, the smile never faltering, but still, she didn't speak. The silence between them stretched, thick with something dark, something unspoken. Behind her, the doors to the church creaked open ever so slightly, as if welcoming her back inside, or inviting him in. Ben's mind raced. Had she been trapped in the church? No, that didn't make sense. And why hadn't Father Michael mentioned seeing her? He had been with the townspeople the whole time. There was no explanation for her sudden appearance, not after being gone for days. "Lila, talk to me," Ben pleaded, taking a cautious step forward. "We've been looking for you. Are you hurt?" Still no response. Then, a soft whisper, barely audible, floated through the air. It wasn't Lila's voice. It was deeper, almost a growl, coming from behind her. "She belongs to us now." Ben froze, his blood turning to ice. His eyes darted around, trying to find the source of the voice, but there was nothing, just the fog, thick and impenetrable. The church bell tolled again, its mournful sound slicing through the tension. "I need you to come with me," Ben urged, his voice shaking. "We can go home. Everything will be okay." Lila's smile faded, her expression becoming blank, almost mechanical. She blinked slowly, as if processing his words, but then her lips parted, and she finally spoke. "It's too late, Ben." Her voice was distant, hollow, and wrong. It echoed unnaturally, as though it wasn't just her speaking, but something else using her as a vessel. Ben felt the weight of her words crush down on him. Too late for what? What had happened to her? Before he could respond, the doors to the church opened wider, and from within the darkened interior, he could see shapes, figures standing just beyond the threshold, shrouded in shadow. There were more of them, their eyes glowing faintly in the dim light. They stood silent, motionless, like sentinels guarding the entrance. Ben took a step back, panic rising in his chest. He had to get her out of there, away from whatever had taken hold of her. But Lila didn't move. Her eyes followed him as he retreated, and with each step he took, the figures in the church seemed to inch closer, their presence pressing against him like an invisible weight. The whispering grew louder, a chorus of voices now, all blending together, calling his name, beckoning him into the darkness. "Ben! Ben!" He turned, ready to run again, but then Lila moved. Her hand shot out, grabbing his wrist with a strength that didn't belong to her. "Don't go," she whispered, her eyes pleading now, the cold smile gone. For a brief moment, it was her again. His sister, desperate and afraid. "Lila," Ben gasped, his heart twisting painfully in his chest. "I'm not leaving you, but we have to get away from here. Whatever this is, it's not safe." But her grip only tightened, her fingers digging into his skin. "You don't understand," she said, her voice trembling, tears welling up in her eyes. "It's inside me, Ben. I can't fight it." The shadows from the church began to stretch, creeping toward them like living tendrils of darkness. Ben could feel the cold creeping up his spine, the presence in the air thickening, suffocating. "I won't let them take you," Ben said, his voice firm despite the terror gnawing at him. Lila shook her head, her tears spilling down her cheeks. "They already have." And then, without warning, she released him. Ben stumbled back, catching himself on the railing of the church steps. He watched in horror as Lila stepped backward into the shadows, her body consumed by the darkness that waited inside. The figures in the doorway receded, taking her with them, until she was gone. Ben stood there, shaking, staring at the empty church. The whispers had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed was worse. The darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own, and he knew, deep down, that this wasn't over. Whatever had taken his sister, whatever was lurking in the shadows of Grenton, was just getting started, and it wanted more. How far will Ben go to save his sister? Subscribe to follow his journey into the heart of darkness. Chapter 5. Into the Abyss. Ben didn't know how long he stood outside the church, staring at the place where his sister had vanished. The fog clung to him like a cold blanket, making it hard to think, to breathe. The weight of everything was crushing down on him. Lila's disappearance, the unnatural darkness swallowing the town, the terrifying figures lurking just out of reach. He had come so close, but Lila had slipped away, and now, something much darker was pulling her deeper into the shadows. It wasn't just about finding her anymore. It was about saving her from whatever had taken hold of her. He couldn't go back to the house. The others would be waiting there, frightened, hopeful. He couldn't bear to see their faces when he told them Lila was gone. And the truth was, he didn't know if he could face them at all. Not until he had answers. With a deep breath, Ben turned away from the church, glancing once more at the place where the figures had stood. There was no sign of them now, but he could feel their presence, lingering just beneath the surface, watching, waiting. He couldn't fight the sense that the town itself was alive. Something ancient and angry, stirring beneath the ground, pulling the darkness closer with each passing hour. As Ben started back down the foggy street, his footsteps echoing on the cobblestones, he noticed the town had grown even quieter. Not a single light flickered in any of the windows. No sounds of voices, no cars, no signs of life. Grenton had become a ghost town, and it felt like the darkness was feeding on it. Ahead, he spotted a figure moving through the mist, walking slowly, as though they were being careful not to disturb whatever waited in the fog. Ben's heart leaped into his throat. Was it Lila? Could she have somehow escaped? He quickened his pace, closing the distance. Lila? He called out, but as he approached, the figure turned, and Ben's hopes were dashed. It was Father Michael. The priest's face was pale, his eyes hollow with fear. He clutched a Bible to his chest as though it were the only thing holding him together. Ben, he said, his voice trembling, I've been looking for you. What's happening? Ben demanded, stopping in front of him. What's happening to this town? To Lila? Father Michael shook his head, his hands shaking. I don't know, he whispered, but something is terribly wrong. The church isn't safe anymore. Ben's blood ran cold. What do you mean? That's where you told everyone to go. Father Michael's eyes darted around as if he was afraid something might overhear. I thought it would help, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. I thought we could fight it with faith, with light. But it's stronger than that. It's ancient, Ben. Older than anything we understand. It's been waiting, and now it's awake. Ben clenched his fists. And what about Lila? Took her. I saw her. Right there in the church. Father Michael's face darkened. It doesn't just take them, Ben. It uses them. Your sister is still in there, but she's not herself. Whatever's inside her, it's growing. It won't stop until it consumes everything. A wave of nausea washed over Ben as he absorbed the weight of the priest's words. He couldn't let that happen. Not to Lila. Not to anyone else. Is there a way to stop it? Ben asked, his voice tight with desperation. Father Michael hesitated, looking down at the Bible in his hands. There's a place, he said slowly, deep in the woods. It's ancient, older than this town, older than anything we've known. It's where this all started. Ben's pulse quickened. What do you mean? The darkness, the shadows. They're not natural, Ben. They've always been here, just beneath the surface. And there's something out there in the woods that's calling to it, feeding it. Ben's stomach twisted. So what do we do? Father Michael took a deep breath, his face filled with a heavy dread. We have to go there, to the source. If we don't, this thing, it won't stop. It'll take the whole town. Ben felt the weight of the decision pressing down on him. It felt insane to go deeper into the heart of the darkness that was already swallowing them whole. But what other choice did he have? Let's go, Ben said, determination hardening his voice. Father Michael nodded, though his expression remained grim. We may not come back. Ben met his gaze, his voice low and steady. We have to try. With a shared look of understanding, the two men turned and started toward the woods, leaving the desolate town behind. The fog thickened around them as they made their way into the forest, the oppressive weight of the darkness growing with each step. The trees towered above them, their branches twisting unnaturally, reaching out like skeletal hands. The path ahead was barely visible, swallowed by the dense mist. Ben's heart pounded in his chest, but he forced himself to move forward. He couldn't let fear control him, not now. As they ventured deeper into the woods, the whispering began again, faint at first, like a distant murmur, but growing louder with each step. Ben could hear his name in the voices, along with Lila's, always Lila's. The shadows shifted around them, moving in the corner of his vision, watching, waiting. And somewhere, deep in the darkness, something ancient and evil stirred. What terrible force lies at the heart of the woods? Subscribe to follow Ben's journey into the depths of Shadowland. Chapter 6. The Heart of Shadowland. The deeper they ventured into the woods, the more twisted the landscape became. Trees contorted into unnatural shapes, their bark blackened and split as if some malevolent force had twisted them from the inside out. The path, once well-trodden by hunters and hikers, was now barely discernible, swallowed by roots that coiled like serpents underfoot. Ben could feel the air growing heavier, denser, as though the very atmosphere was thick with the weight of centuries-old secrets. Every step felt like walking through quicksand, each breath labored. The forest was alive with whispers now, voices just beyond the edge of hearing, echoing through the fog like faint screams. Father Michael walked beside him, his face grim, his knuckles white as he gripped the Bible tighter. The priest hadn't spoken in some time, but Ben could tell by the way his eyes darted around that he was just as unnerved. The further they went, the less this place felt like the woods Ben had grown up exploring. It felt otherworldly, like they had crossed into a place where human rules no longer applied. Suddenly, the forest opened up into a small clearing. In the center stood a stone altar, ancient and weathered, its surface etched with symbols that neither of them could understand. The fog swirled around it, drawn to the altar like a living thing. This was the heart of it all, where the darkness had begun. Ben's chest tightened as he looked at the altar, knowing instinctively that it held the key to everything. The air here was thick with an energy he couldn't explain, an oppressive presence that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. Something waited here, something far older and more dangerous than they had imagined. Father Michael took a tentative step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "This is it," he said, glancing around. "The source of the darkness." Ben nodded, swallowing hard. His mouth was dry, and his pulse pounded in his ears. He could feel it too, the ancient, malevolent presence that had been lurking in the shadows all along. And he could feel something else. Lila. She was close. He could sense her, just beyond the veil of the fog. "We need to destroy it," Ben said, his voice trembling slightly as he approached the altar. "Whatever it is, we have to end this." Father Michael nodded, though his face was pale. "There's only one way." He held up the Bible, but his hands were shaking. "We cleanse it, banish it." Ben wasn't sure what that meant. How could they possibly banish something that felt so powerful? But he didn't have time to ask. The shadows around the clearing began to stir, and the whispering grew louder, more urgent. Ben turned, his eyes scanning the edge of the forest, and that's when he saw her. Lila. She stood at the tree line, her face pale, her eyes dark and hollow. Her once lively expression was now a mask of sorrow and dread, but there was still something of his sister in her gaze, something pleading, as though she were trapped inside her own body. "Lila!" Ben called out, stepping toward her, but Father Michael grabbed his arm. "Ben, no," the priest warned. "She's not herself." Ben's heart twisted painfully in his chest. "I can save her," he said, pulling his arm free. "She's still in there. I know she is." But as he moved closer, Lila's expression changed. Her face twisted into a cruel smile, her eyes glowing with a dark energy that sent a shiver down his spine. The shadows coiled around her, merging with her body, until she was no longer fully human. The darkness had claimed her. "Ben," she whispered, her voice echoing unnaturally. "It's too late." He froze, watching in horror as the shadows began to crawl toward him, reaching out with claw-like tendrils. He could feel the cold seeping into his bones, the malevolent force drawing him closer to the altar. Father Michael stepped forward, raising the Bible. His voice was strong now, filled with a kind of desperate courage. "In the name of the light, I banish you," he shouted, the words echoing through the clearing. The air crackled with energy, and for a moment, the shadows recoiled, pulling back from the altar. But it wasn't enough. The darkness was too strong, too old. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a deep, guttural growl reverberated through the air, a sound that came from everywhere and nowhere at once. Ben's mind raced. He could feel the presence of the darkness all around him, suffocating, relentless. But he could also feel Lila, His real sister, still fighting, still holding on somewhere deep inside the monster she had become. He couldn't let her go. Not like this. With a surge of determination, Ben stepped toward the altar, reaching into his jacket pocket. He pulled out the candle Father Michael had given him, the one he had clung to since the beginning. The flame flickered weakly in the oppressive dark, but it was still there, still burning. Ben placed the candle on the altar, right in the center of the ancient stone symbols. "Lila," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I know you're in there. Fight it." The shadows surged again, lashing out toward him, but Ben didn't move. He kept his eyes locked on his sister, willing her to hear him, to fight. And then, for a brief moment, Lila's eyes softened. The dark energy around her wavered, but the darkness wasn't done with them yet. The growl intensified, shaking the ground. The shadows writhed, desperate to claim them all. And then the flame flickered and flared, bright enough to pierce the blackness. There was a deafening roar, and everything went white. Is the darkness defeated, or has it only begun? Subscribe to witness the final confrontation in the heart of Shadowland. The end. If you enjoyed our story, subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications.